Good evening. We have a nice turnout tonight. What a diverse group we have in the room tonight. I would like to start off, I know she had something come up and could not make it, but I do want to thank Brianna Sittler for all of the hard work that she does putting this Kaleidoscope series together. And for those of you who know her, she's got a big job and does a great job. So even though she couldn't make it tonight, I do want to extend my appreciation to her. I'd like to, as I look around the room, it's really a nice eclectic group. I see a lot of people here from the community. We have some administrators here, and perhaps the most important or the most special group of people in the room tonight are the students. Where are the students? All right, we have a lot of students here tonight. I want to start off by talking a little bit about why did I want to do a presentation on this topic. First of all, when you do a presentation to such a diverse group, it's sometimes very difficult to speak to different audiences. So what I would encourage you to do, I know there's some people who've been here who are here tonight who've been in the field for 10, 20, 30 years and might have heard some of this before. There's some of you who are just going out into the field. I want to encourage you to look at this topic through whatever lens you choose to look at it through, because you're all coming from a very different place. So this topic is going to address things from different perspectives. My interest in correctional education really came as the result of 3 different experiences. The first was working as a forensic clinician at the Hampden County Correctional Center. The second was working with the CHD Community Adolescent Treatment Program doing a book club. And the third came from my doctoral studies in doing my practicum. So over the years, I've had a chance to see some interesting different parts of society, and more importantly, how the systems sometimes work together and sometimes how they really don't work together. So prior to coming here to Bay Path full-time, I worked as a forensic clinician at the Hampden County Correctional Center. And I was assigned to work with pretrial men, those who were detained after they got arrested. So if you turn on the news and you see there was a murder, there was a home invasion, there was some arrests for drug offenses, those were the individuals I was working with in the jail. And what happened is, after working there for several years, part of what I had to do as a licensed mental health counselor was do intakes, and I got to know the individuals very well, and I got to know their backgrounds. And I kept seeing over and over again 8th, 9th, and 10th grade dropout, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade dropout, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade dropout. So I really started wondering what is going on here. And I think that was probably the first time that I really started noticing that there might be some link between education and incarceration. And I started looking at this problem through the age-old question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. And I've never been able to solve this problem. I have no idea which came first, the chicken or the egg. But thankfully, I wasn't looking at chickens and eggs. I was trying to figure out which came first. Problem behaviors, which led to students dropping out of school, or difficulties in school, which led to students getting in trouble with the law. And I wasn't sure which way it was going, which one causes the other. And I became more curious about this, and I had a lot of questions as I worked with these offenders who, most of them were under the age of 25. Most of them were gang involved. Many of them were there on very serious charges, and many of them had histories of substance abuse. So some of the questions that I started asking myself is, why are so many adult offenders have a history of dropping out of school or not being in school? Were they expelled? Was it family circumstances such as homelessness that might have contributed to their legal issues? Were there substance abuse or mental health issues either at home or perhaps with themselves? Did the school system fail them in some way? Did society fail them in some way? Did the family fail them in some way? Was there a lack of resources? Was there a missed opportunity for an intervention from a parent, a teacher, a coach, a friend, or some other key stakeholder in the community? You know, it's interesting when I'm sitting with an adult offender and they're in jail and I ask them the question, how old were you when you started doing drugs? I would say 9 out of 10 times they have an answer. They know when they first picked up. And then I'll ask them, tell me, what was going on in your life then? And they always have an answer. Well, that's when my parents got divorced. That's when they moved. That's when my brother got shot and killed on the streets. And it's become clear to me that it seems as if there's a lot of students and a lot of youth in the community who might have that one incident in their life happen where if somebody was there or there was some resource there, might have helped them go down a different path. I also wondered about peer pressure. How strong is the peer pressure, especially when you're talking about gang involvement? Was it a case of maybe they were struggling academically? Maybe they had a learning disability that went undiagnosed. Maybe they had ADHD and weren't getting treatment for it and felt like they were a failure and couldn't do well in school and found ways outside of school to feel good about themselves. Did they have medical issues? So this was really the first time that I started looking at the issue of education and incarceration. And as you can see, it raised a lot of questions for me. Over the years, I've heard a lot in the media, in different circles that I've been in, how juvenile offenders and gang members are lazy, they're not interested in school, and I hear the term thugs thrown around quite loosely. And I want to keep this up here for a few minutes because I want you to think about what image comes to mind when you hear the term thugs. It's usually not a very positive one, is it? Okay. I've heard promises to get tough on crime and put these thugs behind bars, but I'm not hearing as many promises to help fix what is the root of the problem. In 2008, I co-founded a book club with Bob Dreswick from the CHD Community Adolescent Treatment Program. And so every semester, I take students in one of 2 forensic psych classes that I teach here. And we go to the Community Adolescent Treatment Program. So I have young women from an all-women's private university going into a juvenile correctional center to do a book club with incarcerated youth. You know these thugs, right? That label of thugs. And guess what happens? It works. And it's been phenomenal. And I find that the students realize that their perception of youth offenders and of these so-called thugs, that term that I really hate, is not what they expected. And they come back and they say they were so polite and they were so nice and they were so motivated, they were so interested, they were reading. It seems like they really wanted to be there. And then I noticed that the students start becoming the champions and they start saying things like, I hope he passes his GED. Well, I heard so-and-so is applying to college. I really hope he gets in. If he needs any help with his application, would I be able to help him? Can I help him through the process? And they start rooting for the young men. And it's so great to see that some of the stigma in some of what the media portrays is being changed. But most importantly, I see the students having hope, and having hope that these young men can turn their lives around and that they will. And from the perspective of the young men, it seems to empower them to sit in a room of college students and sometimes find out that they're reading the same book that a college student is. And there's a couple things that have happened in the book club that have really stuck with me. And one of them is the first time we ever did the book club back in 2008. We went around the room and we all read whatever book we want. We don't all read the same book. And at the end of it, one of the young men raised his hand and said, hey, Bob, can I get a library card? I never had one before. And the young man next to him said, yeah, I heard they're free. And I want to ask you, when was the last time you heard a teenager ask for a library card? The image of thug I had in my head was not matching what I was seeing. One semester, we had a young man who asked to be in the book club. This was a young man who could not read and write. But yet, he wanted to put himself out there amongst his peers and participate in this book club. And he came. And in terms of the book club, I'll leave you with that final thought, that a young man, an incarcerated youth, who was supposedly one of these thugs who couldn't read and write, actually wanted to participate in a book club. The third major influence that I had that still fostered my interest in correctional education was an experience I had doing my doctoral studies and doing my practicum. I had a chance to work with some incarcerated youth who were receiving special education services. And again, I wasn't seeing a thug. I was sitting down next to a young man who was interested in learning and who was trying. And again, I really had to question some of the images that are portrayed in the media. So as a result of these experiences, I've kind of found this little niche of correctional education and have really been interested in exploring that relationship between education and incarceration. And in the United States, we take a pretty heavy-handed approach to how we deal with our problems. We have a history of incarcerating. We're strong on incarceration, and we're not really strong in the areas of prevention and intervention. In fact, according to the International Center for Prison Studies, the United States has the highest prison population in the world. Of 100,000 individuals in the United States, 716 per 100,000 are incarcerated. It's the highest in the world. More than 10.2 million people are held in penal institutions throughout the world. Almost half of these are in the US, in Russia, and China. In the juvenile offender population, approximately 106 individuals per 100,000, and that's according to the Office of Juvenile Justice and Detention Prevention, are incarcerated. Our nation may be a leader in many areas. I'm not sure if this is the area we want to take the lead in, though. The U.S. has 2.24 million people behind bars on any given day. Russia has 0.68 million, and China has 1.64. More than half of the countries, about 54%, have incarceration rates less than 150 per 100,000. So we are really well above that average. And this data includes information and comparisons in 222 countries, and we rank number 1. So what is the school-to-prison pipeline? There's been several definitions about the school-to-prison pipeline, and I do want to make one thing clear. In my eyes, the school-to-prison pipeline is not about teacher bashing. If you look at any of the definitions, what the school-to-prison pipeline is referring to is systemic issues that involve our youth in the educational system, which also include other aspects such as poverty and racial issues and family issues and substance abuse and mental health. The whole system together, some are saying is not really working well together. For tonight's presentation, I'm going to focus on the roles of education and specifically special education and zero tolerance policies. And I want you to also be thinking about some of the other underlying themes such as single-family households, poverty, neighborhoods, where are these youth growing up? So here are a few definitions that I think capture the spirit and intent of the concept well. And this is by Erica Myers. The policies, ideologies, and local practices that move a select group of young people from schools to prison. And the term select here is key, and as you see throughout this discussion, you will see that there seems to be some disproportionate representation of who's incarcerated. Here's a definition proposed by Janae Sander that I also particularly liked, that the school-to-prison pipeline refers to systemic setbacks that gradually shepherd students away from positive school connections and academic success and into increasing criminal activity. And this definition, I think, really touches upon the need to keep youth in school, because once a student leaves school and they become disengaged with the system, that is when the school dropouts and the expulsions, the data shows, leads to delinquent behavior. In an article published in the Journal of Education and Treatment of Children, Michael Nelson said it very well, and this is one of the favorite quotes in any literature I've read probably in the last 5 years. The juvenile justice system is a default system because it's where students who can't read, write, or relate tend to wind up when they drop out or are kicked out of school. And this statement reflects the contributions of both academic underachievement and being removed from school and that lack of engagement in the juvenile delinquency. So what's the landscape of education look like in Massachusetts? How do we rate? There's been a lot of concern that students from the United States are not doing as well in areas, especially of math and science, compared to other countries in the world. There was an interesting article that one of my colleagues shared with me in the New York Times that was written last year by Kenneth Chang. And he was commenting on the performance of students in Massachusetts compared to other countries in the United States. And his conclusion was this: if Massachusetts were a country, its 8th graders would rank 2nd in the world in science, behind only Singapore. And this is according to the TIMSS, the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Studies, which surveys knowledge and skills of 4th and 8th graders around the world. We would rank 2nd. And the most recent version of this was done in 2011, and this included more than 600,000 students and 63 nations. So we fared pretty well. In Massachusetts, the 8th grade students also performed well in math. They came in 6th, and they were behind Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan. So how did the country do as a whole when you look at 8th grade performance compared to 62 other countries? Our students ranked 10th in science and 9th in math. And these scores are all above the international average. So it's interesting to know that the students in Massachusetts did particularly well when compared to their peers in the 63 countries, so there would be 62 other countries. And in a 2012 report commissioned by the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, they found that Massachusetts has the 2nd highest rate of special education identification in the United States. We're at 17% of our students in Massachusetts are eligible for special education. More than 17% of kindergarten through 12th graders, students in Massachusetts are eligible. Massachusetts is 2nd only to Rhode Island, which has approximately a 19% eligibility rate. So it's interesting to know that 17% of students in Massachusetts receive special ed services. So throughout the state, 17% of the students have special ed. But when you look at who's incarcerated, 45% of our incarcerated youth from the state receive special education services. And I want to be clear that these 45% are coming from the state of Massachusetts. So the question is, why is there such a disproportionate number of students with special education who are in DYS custody, which is, for those of you, I want to clarify, the Department of Youth Services is the agency in Massachusetts who's responsible for the care and custody of incarcerated youth or adjudicated youth. And now I want to touch upon education in DYS for a moment. I have to say DYS in Massachusetts has some really good leadership, and they're doing a lot of things right. Some of the issues that come up when a student ends up in DYS and across the country, not just in Massachusetts, is that there has to be an efficient means in order to get the school records from the school they're coming from to DYS. Then as the student moves throughout the DYS system through the different levels of security, and then back to the school. So if a student has an IEP or 504 plan and they come from, I don't know, Agawam High School, and they end up in DYS, that needs to be transferred from Agawam High School to DYS, and then throughout the system. They also need to be able to provide appropriate accommodations once they get in there. And a lot of these facilities really struggle to find places to do things such as provide a quiet area to take a test or provide time and a half to take a test. And I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges juvenile justice facilities face, is that students go to class by unit, not by grade. So when you're in high school, the 9th grade students are all taking the same class, right? But in DYS, you go by whatever unit you're on, whether it's a detention unit or a committed unit. So it's quite possible you can have an 8th grader and a 12th grader sitting in the same classroom. And that poses a particular challenge for the teachers. Sadly, for some of the kids who enter the DYS system, this might be the last chance that they have to get their education. And while they are in there, they are required to go to school. They still take the MCAS. They still work towards getting their GED. The next few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about the link between special education and academic underperformance and juvenile delinquency. And I want to illustrate some of the disproportionate numbers of students with disabilities along with other racial issues that have emerged. And over the course of the last 40 to 50 years, researchers have really been doing a good job demonstrating a relationship between academic underachievement and juvenile delinquency. In the 1960s, Mulligan reported that 72% of youth who were referred for delinquency had reading levels significantly below the current grade placement. In the 1970s, Miller and Windhauser commented on the relationship between poor reading skills and juvenile delinquency. And specifically, they found that students with poor reading skills were more likely to experience poor school adjustment, low self-esteem, anxiety about previous school failures, and a very low tolerance for frustration in school. A national study that was published in the late 1970s reported that greater than one-third of incarcerated youth read below the 4th grade level. And more recently, and this was published in the Journal of Correctional Education, a majority of incarcerated youth are at least 2 years behind in academic skills compared to their peers and have higher rates of grade retention, absenteeism, suspension, and expulsion. Regina Foley did a meta-analysis in 2001 that really, I think, started the dialogue in this area, and it was one of the most cited studies that I've come across. And in this study, she did a hand search of 64 different journals and 4 electronic databases. It was very comprehensive. And I want to share a few of her findings with us. Academic achievement was consistently reported to be 1 year to several years below expected grade levels, with delinquent youth functioning between 5th and 6th grade levels on standardized measures of spelling. Full-scale IQ scores tended to range from 80 to 100, which is in the low average to average range. They also found that incarcerated youth consistently performed 1 year to several years below grade level, with 5th to 9th grade levels of academic functioning being reported for both males and females. So for those of you who might be future teachers, I know we have many students here majoring in education. Not only are you dealing with students in different grades in the same classroom, but you're also dealing with students being at very different places in terms of their skills and their capabilities. Some other findings, I didn't switch that one, were that incarcerated juveniles were classified as non-recidivist, which means they left jail and did not return back, performed significantly higher than recidivists on standardized measures of basic academic skills. And compared to non-delinquent peers, incarcerated youth performed significantly lower on standardized measures of academic achievement. Their meta-analysis also indicated that a majority of youth reported a history of academic difficulties, including academic failure and poor school experience. And overall, their findings did find support that academic achievement and involvement in the juvenile justice system do exist. There was another really interesting study done called the Survey of Youth in Residential Treatment Programs, and this was conducted by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And the findings were based on interviews with a nationally representative population of 7,073 youth in custody, so it was a rather large study. And significant findings were found in all 4 areas that they looked at, which included mental health, substance abuse, healthcare, and education. A couple of the findings from this study that are relevant to tonight's discussion. When you look at non-enrollment rates for youth in custody, 21% of the youth in custody were not in school at the time of first arrest, compared to 5% in the general population, those youth who are not in the care and custody of the state. Big discrepancy there. The percentage of youth functioning below appropriate grade level, almost half, 48% of the youth in custody were below grade level, compared to 28% nationally in the general population. The rates of expulsion and suspension, 61% of the youth had been suspended or expelled, compared to only 8%. That's a really big difference. And a quarter of the youth in custody were held back 1 year or more, compared to 11%. Now, when you look at this, the rate of non-enrollment for students, so those students who might have dropped out of school, and the rates of expulsion or suspension, if you add 21% plus 61%, you get 82%. So 82% of the youth who are incarcerated are not engaged in school for one reason or another. And this is really problematic because it really tears kids away from anybody who might be able to intervene, who might be able to help some special programming. And also, what are they doing with their time? What's the structure like? Is there any supervision? But 82% of the kids were not in school. There was another study that I thought was really interesting. Harris and her colleagues did a study that looked at the academic achievement levels of incarcerated youth in juvenile correctional facilities in 3 regions: the Southeast, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Southwest. Few of the more salient findings here. In the Mid-Atlantic region, 39% of incarcerated youth require special ed services, compared to 10% of youth in the general population. So that's almost 4 times the rate. 31% of incarcerated youth in the Southwest receive education services, compared to 7% of youth in the general population. And in the Southeast, this I found really interesting. 10.3% of the population carried the diagnosis of mental retardation. And I do want to comment on one thing here. We do no longer use the term mental retardation. That has been changed. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to use the terminology that was reported in the study. At the time this study was done, this was the criteria, the Access to criteria, and the DSM-4 that was used. And I do want to acknowledge that this is old terminology. And in reporting some of this, if I refer to African American versus Black or Hispanic versus Latino, know that I'm reporting what the authors and the researchers used in their study as the criteria. And this was published in the journal Behavioral Disorders. Providing quality education within juvenile justice facilities has been cited as having one of the strongest long-term influences of all services provided. And it's important to remember that the students go back to the school systems in the community that they came from, so those educational services that they receive are crucial. And there's a few challenges when trying to teach in juvenile correctional education settings. We already talked about one, that the students go to school by unit, not by grade level. But there's also very complicated systems of oversight with management from the local, regional, and state levels. It can be a high-stress environment. You tend to have high staff turnover. And sometimes the staff are working difficult shifts, nights, weekends, holidays. There's also the competing demands for safety versus education. And sometimes they kind of bump heads together. You may have a class that's frequently interrupted because of transfer of students. You may have staff sitting in the room with walkie-talkies going off. And I know how easy it is to get distracted if you're trying to take an exam or do any work. They also found the same difficulties with obtaining educational records. And then there was another group who looked at schooling in a mid-sized youth prison out in the western part of the country. And they found that some of the classrooms were makeshift. In fact, one of the classrooms was actually balcony space, and other classrooms were on the living units, and the windows were painted black. So for those students living in dorms, would you want to be holding class in your living area with the windows painted black? Class time was often reduced because of safety issues. They had no internet access and very little access to computers for safety reasons. In fact, they found some of the computers were stored away in a closet. And this is interesting because we're developing standardized tests that are coming down the pike, and some already exist, where the students are going to be required to take these standardized tests by computers. But we're not giving them access to learn how to use the computers. Stigma was cited as a really big issue, and I'm kind of going back to that thug word that we used earlier. They found really high levels of stigma, not just among the youth, but also among some of the staff, who all of them were joking about their charges and their criminal behavior. What a great way to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And again, student transients, that issue of moving records around and having students move from different unit to different unit, which also makes it very difficult for the students to establish any trusting relationship with the teacher, or for the teachers to get to know the students. They also found the use of social lessons rather than academic lessons, things like plugging in a movie instead of using textbooks. One student, going back to, again, difficulties transferring records, one student actually waited 4 months for his records to come from his school system. And I do have to say, I know Massachusetts has worked really well, and that is something that they have worked on over the last several years, and that system is very much improved. Common disciplinary action is to keep students out of school, not have them go to school because of poor behavior. So what does that do? Well, that rewards the poor behavior. Hey, if I act out, I can get out of going to class. Great. So what are they going to do tomorrow? Perhaps the same thing. And it also leads to them falling behind. Lack of family involvement was also cited as an issue, and we could talk about that for years. It's really important to get the family, whether they're incarcerated or out in the community, involved, and we know that in some cases that's great and that's a strength for the youth, and we know in other cases that's a really big issue. So we've looked at the disproportionate number of students with special education services. Now I want to take a look at a different angle. And I think this statement sums it up pretty well. Incarcerated youth are disproportionately ethnically and linguistically diverse, more often identified for special education, and come to correction with a history of negative educational experiences. I want to compare the demographics of incarcerated youth with the demographics of the country. Now, when you look at the number of juveniles in terms of the country, 54% of our youth are Caucasian. And when you look at who's incarcerated, only 32%. And again, I'm using the terminology they reported of Caucasian and white to keep it consistent with what they reported. When you look at Black, 15% of our youth in Massachusetts are Black, but yet 40% of the youth in DYS are Black. Hispanic, when you compare it nationally, is pretty similar, and the Asian and other and American categories are pretty similar. So what's it look like in Massachusetts? 70% of our youth in Massachusetts in DYS are non-Caucasian. 70%. That's a high number. When you look at Massachusetts, 68% of the youth are Caucasian. When you look at African American, 9% of Massachusetts youth are African American, but 28%, 3 times as many, are who's in our DYS system. And same thing with Hispanic. 16% of our youth are Hispanic, but they make up 34% of the DYS population. And this really represents, I think, the disproportionate number of minority youth who are incarcerated. And it's also interesting to note, males represent about 86.5% of the youth in DYS, and females are 13.5%. So there's a strong body of evidence that suggests that students with disabilities and those receiving special education services are really disproportionately represented in our incarcerated youth in the juvenile justice system. There's also evidence that strongly suggests that non-Caucasians are overrepresented. And the question is why? Like, what is happening? Okay. And again, I'm only shedding light on a few of the factors here in terms of the role of education, but it's a start. And as I said before, one of the things I want to do is just bring this to an open awareness, and I hope that everybody here tonight looks at this through whatever lens is appropriate for them and they want to look at it through. I'd like to turn my attention now to zero tolerance policies. Okay. Zero tolerance policies have been a bit controversial. In 2008, the results of the American Psychological Association Zero Tolerance Task Force was published in the American Psychologist. And this task force defined zero tolerance policies as a philosophy or policy that mandates the application of predetermined consequences, most often severe and punitive in nature, that are intended to be applied regardless of the gravity of behavior, mitigating circumstances, or situation context. So the spirit of the zero tolerance policy is that there's no room for any discretion and no room really for examining each individual case based on its merits. And the widespread use of zero tolerance policies really began in the early 1990s as a tool used for drug enforcement, and then it became widely adopted by the school systems. So here the phrase intended to be applied regardless of the gravity of behavior, mitigating circumstances, or situational context is what seems to be the controversial part of these. Janae Sander provided another, what I think is a comprehensive definition of zero tolerance policies, which is that zero tolerance policies are those disciplinary actions that are immediate, automatic, applied to all instances of the behavior without specific regard for the level of safety, disruption, or risk, often involving expulsion or suspension from school. And again, this definition really speaks to any lack of flexibility in the definition or the wide range of behaviors that can happen in any school system. So one of the questions that you could raise about zero tolerance policies are, do they take away that opportunity for the teachable moment? You know, when you might want to be sitting with a student and saying, hey, you know, what happened probably shouldn't have happened, and what you did wasn't right. But how much do you want to punish and hurt that student? Or is this a time for learning and for that teachable moment? Now, I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't expel anybody, we shouldn't suspend anybody, we shouldn't arrest anybody. There are certainly cases where that is absolutely warranted. However, some have really cited that the lack of flexibility in these circumstances really has become problematic. And I want to share a few cases that were put forward by the APA task force, and I want you to think about, in these cases, does the punishment fit the offense? So the first case was of a 10-year-old girl, and she went to school and she found a small knife in her lunchbox that her mother had accidentally left in there when she cut up her apple for school. So this 10-year-old girl went up to her teacher, handed in the knife to her teacher, and said, I found this in my lunchbox. The student was expelled from school, kicked out of school for possessing a weapon. So here's a case where a student, young girl, 10 years old, found a knife in her lunchbox. She wasn't intending to inflict physical harm on anybody. She didn't intend to even bring the weapon to school, and she did the right thing. She told the truth. She said, hey, teacher, I have this knife. And she got expelled. And the question I have is, the next time she's in a similar situation, what is she going to do? Is she going to trust an adult? Is she going to trust an authority figure? So, you know, does that punishment fit the crime? Could there have been an alternative action to that? The second case that they brought to light was a case of an adolescent young man, so a teenager, who got caught talking on the phone in school, and you're not supposed to be on the phones in school. But the circumstances were that he was talking to his mother, who was a soldier stationed in Iraq, and he hadn't talked to his mother in 30 days. And, you know, when you're a soldier in Iraq, you don't always have the convenience of calling your children on our time. And it had been 30 days, and he was expelled from school. And again, I understand it's not supposed to be on the phone, but could there be a different alternative? Could there be something set up with the school, for example, for students who do have parents who have, or students who do have parents who are in the military? And can there be some exceptions? Can there be a way, if that's the only time, you're in the desert, you're over in Iraq, if that's the only time you can get in touch with your kid, then there's got to be some mechanism other than kicking the kid out of school. And I think that really goes against everything we know about trying to establish the parent-child bond and keep kids connected with their parents. So I'll let you decide if you feel that punishment fits the crime. Okay. When it comes to zero tolerance policies, and this was from In Teaching Tolerance, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, author Marilyn Elias found that African American students are 3.5 times more likely than their white classmates to be suspended or expelled. African Americans constitute 18% of students, but account for 46% of those students who have been suspended more than once. About 1 in 4 Black children with disabilities were suspended at least once, compared to 1 in 11 white students. And this really ties into our previous discussion about academic underachievement and non-enrollment rates. More than 70% of students arrested in school-related incidents or referred to law enforcement are Black or Hispanic. And in this article, she also commented on a landmark study published last year that tracked nearly 1 million Texas students for at least 6 years and controlled for over 80 variables. And it was found that African American students were disproportionately punished compared with otherwise similar white and Latino students. And children with emotional disabilities were also disproportionately suspended and expelled. And it's interesting that the research is showing that removing kids from school who have problems behavior is not doing anything to improve their behavior. In fact, it's actually increasing the likelihood that they will become involved in the juvenile justice system. In January of this year, the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights issued some guidance to try to assist public and elementary, secondary schools in meeting the obligations under federal law to administer student discipline more fairly. And this was known as a Dear Colleague letter. It was an actual letter. And some of the findings that they cited in this letter to support this was that African American students without disabilities are more than 3 times as likely as the white peers to be expelled or suspended. Although African American students represent 15% of students in civil rights data collection, which were the ones who did this study, they make up 35% of students suspended once, 44% of those suspended more than once, and 36% of students who have been expelled. And over 50% of the students who were involved in school-related arrests or referred to law enforcement are Hispanic or African American. There were cases in which African American students were disciplined more harshly and more frequently because of their race than similarly situated white students. And it's clear that the Department of Education is acknowledging that there is some issues here and they're trying to work towards that. So, when the American Psychological Association created this task force on zero tolerance policies, they had 6 questions that they really wanted to explore. And the first one was, have zero tolerance policies really made schools safer and more effective in handling disciplinary issues? Oops. And the answer to that is no. The task force did not find any support for the claim that zero tolerance policies helped to maintain school order. There's also this belief that school violence is at a crisis level and is rising. And I think part of that might come from the media and the overplaying when there is an incident and how many times that you see it. And in fact, the data actually indicates that since 1985, school violence and disruption has actually either been stable or actually declining over the years. But it doesn't seem that way in part because of the media. The other question they asked was, what has been the impact of zero tolerance on students of color and students with disabilities? Not much. There has not been a lot of support that zero tolerance policies have in any way reduced the bias that has been found. And one of the arguments for originally starting the zero tolerance policies was that if you took that discretionary or that decision making out of the hands of administrators, of police, of whoever's there at the scene and in charge, then there won't be any bias if you say, if they get into a fight, then this is the outcome. That there would be no room for that bias and discrimination. And as you can see, they actually found that that has not been the case at all, even with the zero tolerance policies. So to what extent have zero tolerance policies are they developmentally appropriate as a psychological intervention, taking into account the development of children and youth? In terms of development, we know that the adolescent brain, we have good science and good data telling us that the adolescent brain is really not fully mature and developed until age 24, age 25. And part of that development includes the aspect of being able to make a decision and being able to raise, to consider possible consequences for your action. And a lot of the areas that youth, especially under the age of 15, tend to really struggle with are poor resistant to peer influences, highly suggestible by their peers, being able to think about the future, that future orientation, and impulse control. And until that brain is fully formed, a lot of that can be an issue. So how have zero tolerance policies affected the relationship between education and the juvenile justice system? What they found is that the get tough on crime type of philosophy has really led to an increase in things like security, technology, security personnel, and profiling. And it's interesting, they talk about the concept of profiling and how when you profile students, those who are often identified at most at risk to harm other students or have poor behavior in schools tend to be black. When in fact, when you look at who's committing the violence in the schools, especially your high profile cases, the data doesn't suggest that it's the black kid. In fact, it's typically white youth who are committing things like the mass murders in schools. And especially in the late 1990s, the Secret Service and the FBI and threat assessment teams really took a look at this, and they found that the profiling was not working, and in fact, it was over-identifying kids based on race who really were not at risk. So what's been the impact of zero tolerance policies on families and the communities? There needs to be more research in this area, and one of the things that they really are looking for is more long-term research in this area. But what they have found is it seems as if what they know now is any student who has any vulnerabilities such as mental health issues or substance abuse issues, the zero tolerance policies tend to create conditions that are ripe for getting into trouble. And are there other disciplinary alternatives that could make a stronger contribution toward maintaining school safety or the integrity of the learning environment while keeping a greater number of students in school? And researchers are still taking a look at this. But what they have found in terms of programs that might be helping with this and reducing what constitutes effective school violence programs are programs that have three elements: primary prevention strategies that are targeted at all students, such as bullying prevention; secondary prevention strategies targeted at those students who may be at risk of violence or disruption, such as by threat assessment teams; and tertiary strategies at those students who have already been engaged in disruptive or violent behavior, such as restorative justice programs. The APA Task Force on the Zero Tolerance Policies summed up their findings like this: that despite the removal of large numbers of purported troublemakers, zero tolerance policies have not provided evidence that such approaches can guarantee safe and productive school climates for other members of the student population. And they also pointed out that the increased reliance on these more severe punishments, such as suspension and expulsion, and referrals to the juvenile justice system for matters that typically could be handled by the schools, has really fueled what has come to be known as the school-to-prison pipeline. So the task force said, okay, it seems like zero-tolerance policies aren't really doing what we thought they were supposed to do. And they did make some recommendations, and one of them was to apply these policies with greater flexibility, taking the context into account. Let the schools have some flexibility, let the professional school staff make some decisions, and police, they made the argument that police are given discretion at the scene whether or not to arrest, whether or not to press charges, or say, okay, you guys, take it easy, you go that way, end of the problem, don't want to see you again. But the school systems aren't being given that latitude. The other suggestion they had was that teachers this one's interesting, teachers and other professional staff who have regular contact with students should be the first line of communication with parents and caregivers regarding disciplinary incidents. And I think some people may have some feelings about this. As a teacher in a classroom, do you want to be the one to call the kids' parents when there's an issue involving some sort of discipline? Can that create a problem with the trust between the student and the teacher and that relationship between the student and the teacher? And, the other issue here is teachers have a tough job. Teachers are teaching. Teachers are busy. They're trying to manage 20 to 30 kids in a classroom. Some may have special needs. Some may have behavior issues. And some have argued, is it fair to put teachers in that position? Or should discipline be handled by the school administrators, such as the principal, for example? That schools should define all infractions, whether major or minor, and train the appropriate staff train all staff in appropriate means of handling each infraction. There is something to be said about training staff in how to de-escalate a situation. Having worked on psych units and having worked in jail and been there when things are going wrong, when fights are breaking out, when people are getting agitated, there is something to be said for having de-escalation skills. And one of their recommendations is that actually be implemented, some of the classroom management strategies be implemented in teacher training. And to evaluate the school discipline or school violence prevention and to see, is it working? Or do they need to make any adjustments? And I think a lot of times institutions, whether it be a school or a business, they might do something new or they might try something new and they're afraid to go back and say, hey, this isn't working. And I would argue if what you're doing isn't working, then change it. You can't keep doing the same behavior and expect a different outcome. It doesn't work that way. They also suggested that school systems reserve zero-tolerance policies for only the most severe and violent disruptive behaviors. Expulsions and suspensions, they would argue, should not be the response to, say, a kid who hasn't talked to his mother for 30 days, who's fighting for our country over in Iraq. And they also recommend that they try not to do a one-size-fits-all strategy with dealing with the problems and have more of a graduated system in order to deal with what should be the appropriate remedy for the situation. And they also, I thought this was interesting, they would like to see school police officers take some training in adolescent and development. And I know some of my students here from my adolescent development class are here tonight. I'd be interested in thinking what they think about that. There is this idea of sometimes there are harmless pranks. And it's just that, it's a harmless prank. And there was a case cited by Kevin Matthews who talked about this case where at the last day of school, the students had a water balloon fight. Okay, kind of a fun thing to do. I've done it myself. And in my day, I've had a few water balloon fights or snowball fights. But the last day of school, they had a water balloon fight, and it ended up, the students actually got arrested and charged with disorderly conduct and assault and battery. I don't know. Could there have been a different outcome to that? Or is that kind of developmentally appropriate for teenagers in the last day of school, kind of a harmless prank, to have a water balloon fight? And they're looking for some long-term research on suspended and expelled kids and trying to find out how they end up doing in adulthood. They're looking for more longitudinal data. And they like to expand the research on the connections between the educational system and the juvenile justice system. And they also want to take a look at a more national model in the use of zero tolerance policies and get more information. And they're really looking for more information about the context that they're used in. And also, I think this is another interesting point, conduct a cost-benefit analysis to see how is the community and the school benefiting when you remove the student. Is it making a positive difference for the school? So tonight we really just covered the tip of the iceberg. And this is just a brief overview of a problem that, like an iceberg, might seem superficial, and we know a few things about it, but it's actually a lot more deeper than we probably even know about. And it's difficult to generalize about this issue because each student that you're dealing with is so different and so unique in their circumstances. But I wanted to end this presentation with a few thoughts I had. One of the thoughts I have is in thinking about all of this, it's really difficult to legislate morality, right? Is it conceivable that we can develop this policy that can take into account all the different scenarios, ranging from mass murders at schools to a kid talking to his mother who's in Iraq in a water balloon fight? It's kind of hard to find that balance in between. I think a big focus needs to be on the individual student, and that's easier said than done, but there's some things I think we can do to kind of help out in this area. One of them is I think we can stop labeling. They aren't SPED kids, and how often do you hear the term SPED kids? And if you are a student receiving special ed services, you might be feeling a little different. You might be feeling a little left out. I hear the term ADHD kid. Oh, the ADHD kids. Oh, yeah, he's an ADHD kid. And, you know, I was really kind of thought about a story that I heard maybe 20, 25 years ago when a friend of the family was diagnosed with diabetes. And I remember I was younger and not totally paying attention to the beginning of the conversation, but my mother's friend came over and she was really having a hard time with the fact that she had been diagnosed with diabetes, and especially back then, they didn't have a lot of the prepared foods we have today. So anywhere she went, she would have to somehow have fruit or crackers or candy. She would have to go places with her own food, and she felt very labeled. She felt very stigmatized. She felt very different. And there were times when she wouldn't go to events and go to places because she felt uncomfortable. You know, she'd have to excuse herself, or she'd be sitting in a movie and have to eat that apple and didn't want it to disturb people around her. And she finally went to a support group for people who have diabetes. And I remember her telling my mother, she said, what a difference it made. And what made a difference for her was at the support group, they said, stop saying I'm a diabetic. Stop referring to yourself by your disease. She said, you're not a diabetic. You're somebody who's living with diabetes. And that might seem like a minor thing, but when we put a label on ourselves that we don't feel good about and that we feel different about, that can really bring us down. And if you feel that way and other people are referring to you that way, oh, you're a SPED kid, or you're an ADHD kid, I don't think we're really doing our youth any favors. And this might be a hard one. We need to listen. And I think that sounds so basic, but when a kid is struggling in school, how many different reasons can we come up with why this kid might be struggling? It could be that the kid needs glasses. It could be that the kid has a hearing problem. It could be the kid has a medical condition, such as diabetes, that might be affecting their concentration. I think we need to give kids more of a voice. And I think we need to allow kids an opportunity to say, I'm not coming to class because I'm afraid of Joe. He's been threatening me. Or I'm not coming to class because my family's homeless. And I'm not doing my homework because I'm having constant headaches. And how easy is it to look at a kid who might not be doing well in school, or to look at that quiet kid and say that kid is not trying? And I've sometimes heard that argument made, sometimes with students with special education, who are probably some of the hardest working kids that are in the class. They are working double time in some cases to do the same work and keep up with their peers. And I want to touch upon something for one moment, and that is ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It is a very, very real condition, and it is one that can really impact anyone as a child or as an adult and really impact their level of functioning. And, it's interesting, going back and working with 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds in jail who are in jail oftentimes on drug charges because somewhere along the line they went down that road of drugs and alcohol. And there's been several times when I've had somebody who said, I have ADHD, and they've put me on Ritalin or they've put me on Strattera, and I say, did it help you? And they'll say, no, it didn't. And I can't contain myself. I feel anxious all the time. I can't concentrate. And they will say that's why they do the drugs, or that's why they drink, is to help them feel better. And I'll have a conversation with them about that. And I'll talk to them about depression. And they'll say, yeah, well, my parents got divorced when I was a sophomore in high school, and I really took it hard. Or my grandfather died, and I was really close to him. And sometimes they'll say there were times when I was depressed, and I didn't even know why. There was no reason for it. And the short version of what I could make a very long story is sometimes we have kids who look like they might have ADHD, but what they really might have is bipolar disorder. And there's been more than one time when the offender was put on lithium or some other medication for the treatment of bipolar disorder. And I had a kid, he wasn't a kid, he was early 20s, come up to me and say, my God, you saved my life. Thank you for sharing this with the psychiatrist, because I had the chance to listen. And in my role, I had the chance to get to know the person. And I saw this pattern of the depression with what sometimes in adolescence could look like ADHD, but could also be hypomania or perhaps mania. But in the classroom, it might look like the symptoms of ADHD. So, I think there needs to be some strong support for support staff in schools, such as school adjustment counselors and school psychologists who can try to tease some of this out. And another thing about what can look like problem behavior in adolescence is that when you look at depression in adolescence, it often looks like anger, and it looks like agitation, and it can look like anxiety. And that's the developmental way that kids and teenagers show us they're depressed. So there's no real mystery why kids sometimes start acting out when the parents are getting divorced. There's often some depression there. So I think we really need to have our schools be more inclusive and have enough supports, because the teachers don't have the time to always get involved. But if a student's acting different, there's a change in their behavior or there's concerning behavior, it'd be nice if they could put a referral in and say, hey, you know, can you check in with this student and see what's going on? I want to also include the courts and law enforcement. You know, there's a lot of discretion at the scene of a crime. When you have young kids who are doing drugs and alcohol, I always want to know what was going on that first time they picked up. I think that is always so telling. There was a case where a young girl, the mother was sick, and then mother needed some over-the-counter medicine, and one, didn't have transportation, two, she was sick and couldn't get there herself, and three, didn't have the money to go and buy it. So as a last resort, she sent her young child to the pharmacy to steal some over-the-counter medication. And that young girl got arrested. She got arrested and got charged with a crime. And, you know, could there have been some intervention there? What's going on with that family? Is that a criminal act? Yes, she stole something, but could there have been something different done for that family? I know it's interesting. I always think of a student that we had graduated from the forensic psychology program a couple years ago who did her internship over in Denmark. And she came back and she said, they don't have jails in Denmark. They don't have crime in Denmark. They don't have what we have here in terms of poverty and racism and all that. And I asked her why she thought that was the case. And she said people get their needs met. In Denmark, they have socialized medicine. You don't have to worry about your health insurance. You don't have to worry about affording treatment. You don't have to worry about not having a job. Things are good there. And she said it was really interesting. While she was there was actually a young man who stabbed another student in school. And she said it was this big old thing all over the news. But it wasn't reporting it and sensationalizing it like they do here in the United States. She said the questions and what you read about were, how can we help this kid? Because there's something not right here, either with the kid or with the family. Denmark does not look through that same punitive, let's incarcerate lens that the United States does. And when you look at the crime levels, it shows. And it's often rated the happiest place to live, so I don't know, maybe they're doing something right. I also think we need to, as adults and as professionals, think outside the box. We know kids like hands-on stuff. We've taken away so much from kids. But before we can think outside the box, we have to think about what's the box that we're in. What are the constraints? What are those things keeping kids in that box and not succeeding? And, you know, look around the room. Who here can you collaborate with? Who here do you share similar ideas with? And, you know, I think overall we need to start looking at our youth in such a way that we're giving them things and skills and resources that help them thrive. And I don't have all the answers. In fact, I don't think I gave many answers tonight. But what I did want to do was just bring this to attention, and hopefully when you leave here, you'll continue this discussion with some of your friends and your peers. But there is one mantra, one philosophy that I have that I hope you quote me on, and I give you permission to quote me on. And in fact, I hope you do quote me on this. And I don't say that very often, but it's this, that it's time we start treating our youth like the first-class citizens that they are. We have students going to schools without books. And we have students not getting homework because there aren't enough books for them to take home. And that, to me, that's inexcusable. We've taken away things like athletics and music in choir, in after-school programs. We're not giving kids that outlet. Developmentally, we're not giving them that chance to run around, run amok in the community, go on the soccer field, get your energy out. We're not doing that. We've taken away all of those things that help kids feel good about themselves, and I think that's so sad. I remember running into somebody I graduated from high school with, and this was maybe 5 years after I graduated. I went into her in the grocery store, and she said, you know, I was a mess in high school. And I'm thinking, yeah, she had her days when she didn't look so good. And she shared with me that she drank quite a bit in high school. But she said the one reason why I didn't drop out of high school was because of choir. And for her, that was her out. And I think especially the young students in the room tonight, if you think back to high school, there might have been something that hooked you in because you didn't drop out, right? You're here. We need to not tolerate things like bullying. We need to address things like discrimination. We need to stop kids when they're picking on other kids. We need to stop saying kids today. Kids today are so awful, right? They're lazy. And I love it when somebody my age says that, and I said, yes, and it was our generation. So if you want to say kids today aren't doing a good job, or kids today are lazy, or kids today aren't as talented and hardworking and stuff that they should be, then we need to point the finger back at us, because we're the ones who are creating the next generation. So I really do think it's unfair to blame kids today. And maybe we need to think about looking at society today, in the struggling parents today, the single households that are just so challenging. I think we need to be better mentors. And I think, you know, mentoring is one of those things that's not so hard to do and it's not so time consuming. Something like a book club doesn't take that much to do to get college students sitting with youth who might benefit from it. And I think lastly, what I want to say is we cannot give up on our youth. They are resilient. They are the most resilient population I think you will ever meet. And in growing up today is very challenging times, economically, in terms of high school kids trying to find jobs. You know, I like to go back to Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And, you know, Maslow is a humanist, and he believes that people are born inherently good. And it starts off with your basic physiological needs. You need water, you need air, you need to breathe. And it goes up through, at some point, if you make it through all the stages, you're self-actualized, and you feel good about yourself, and you get life. And you understand it. When you ask a kid, doesn't matter how old, ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? They always have an answer, right? They may have no idea what it takes or no idea what it is. My friend's son said, I want to be a paleontologist. And I said, Dad, what's a paleontologist? Kids don't have a clue. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be the next LeBron James or Michael Jordan. I want to be a doctor or a lawyer. Did you ever hear a kid say, geez, when I grow up, I hope I'm a loser. I hope I have a horrible life. I hope I'm addicted to drugs. I hope my family hates me. I hope I can experience everything in life that people shouldn't have to experience. I don't think that's how our youth is growing up. I think our youth is very resilient. I think they face a lot of challenges. And I think that the good news is that so many of you are here tonight to hear about this. I think there's hope that some of the people in this room can reach out and start making a difference. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Okay. Questions? I didn't know I had a story or I'm sticking to it, but I guess I do. Okay. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'll entertain them.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes of questions. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you.
Or are we all going to be shy? Or a comment? Down here,
Oh, you're going to make me walk.
Yes. She's going to ask a hard question. I know it.
I will not. You had stated earlier that when students that are incarcerated go to classes, it's by unit.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason for that, and why can't they pull them by appropriate grade level?
That's a really good reason, and part of it is it's safety and security. There's detention units, there's committed units. The youth is placed in the appropriate unit and the level of security. So you might have some kids also in a really secure unit, some might be in a less secure unit, and that has to do with the structure of the system and where they're placed and ultimately where they're assigned to go.
And there's just not enough staff to teach at those certain the appropriate grade level for each of those levels of security? Is that?
I think part of it is, I don't really think it's an issue of staffing as it is more of a security issue in terms of, because in DYS and also in the adult system, you have everything from segregation to pre-release, which is segregation is your maximum security and pre-release is your minimum, and you have that same structure in juvenile centers also. So the students have to stay within their level of security. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge. You have 8th graders and 12th graders and all different levels, and it's a challenge. It certainly is. Good question.
Time for one more, so you're the lucky question.
So I didn't really have a question, I have more of a comment. And I did want to say that there have been some advances made, even if we don't take full advantage in our community of that. We're fortunate enough to have a recovery high school right in Springfield to help those with drug and alcohol addiction still participate in education. And rather than a zero tolerance policy, when someone in that facility has difficulty or slips or relapses, they are given an opportunity to get back on their feet. And that facility is available to all of the schools in this area. Unfortunately, due to the funding issue that occurs in that, it isn't utilized the way it should be.
And funding has been an issue. I don't know what the answer is. I think it's terrible that students don't have books in the classrooms and they can't take books home. I mean, how can we expect students to stay on target? In some areas of the country and some school systems are much better than others. And again, it's difficult to generalize because throughout the country and every school system, even throughout the county and the state and the country, is also different. But the resources and the funding is often what lags behind in providing some of the supports. That's a great comment. Anyone else? All right. Thank you.